Hello, everyone. For the next little bit, we're going to talk about weed control, and in particular, I'm going to focus on these four topics. So, vine control, particularly in corn, that's become more and more of an issue. It seems like, and a very common call from particularly Middle Tennessee. Grass weed control, which is becoming every year, seems like a little more of an issue. And then the kind of the newest thing, the evolution of Dicamba and 240 resistant pigweed here in Tennessee, and maybe have some thoughts on how to manage those particular pigweed. First, kind of hitting on vine control in corn, there's a number of vines that become an issue in our corn crop, particularly late in the season. Pitted and ivy leaf morning glory are very common, but particularly as you get in the middle and east Tennessee, I hear a lot more about burr cucumbers. Some of the other perennial vines seem like, vineweed, that sort of thing, become more of an issue. What we typically see, though, is these vines are pretty much controlled with that pre that's put on or a Halix GT, but after those herbicides wear off, so typically when the corn's getting up 6, 7, 8 leaf, you can see a flush of some of these later vines, and they basically sit there as the corn grows and shades the ground. But we start getting into August and the corn dries down and light hits the ground, they take off. And they can be a heck of a mess when you get out there with the combine. So here's some thoughts of some things that can help you. One herbicide that really isn't a lot of help on these vines, and it's probably part of the reason we see more of an issue with these vines in corn, especially in Middle and East Tennessee, is atrazine is really not a lot of help. It doesn't give us much residual control. You're lucky to get a day or two out of it from a residual standpoint. It really only helps from a post-emergent standpoint. But then again, a lot of these weeds are coming up later than what you can technically apply atrazine, which is 12-inch tall corn. So best strategy then is to try and apply a later post, drag your feet applying it, and then look at either Acuron GT at 3.7 pints, you can apply it up to 8-leaf corn, or Caprino at 3 ounces, you can apply up to 7-leaf corn. Those two herbicides will offer you some extra residual for these late emerging vines. The Caprino's got thibacarbazone in it. It's an SU, and it can give you some real length of control on them. Acuron GT's got bicyclopyrone in it, which gives you some extra help from a residual standpoint on vines. And finally, I like both those herbicides, but I like them spiked with a little bit of status. 4 ounces of status. You can apply up to the 30-inch tall corn, which is in that 7 to 8 leaf corn range typically. Will help you both from a knockdown standpoint on those vines, but also from a residual standpoint. And in particular, if you got some of the perennial vines like the bindweeds, that status will give you a lot of help. The other problem we see more and more, particularly in corn, is Johnson grass. And the first glyphosate-resistant Johnson grass was called to our attention about a decade ago now in southwest Tennessee, in the Shelby and Tipton County area. And it's expanded its range from there, and it is in Middle Tennessee now. It hasn't moved as quick as, say, a pigweed has, because it doesn't produce a lot of seed, and gets moved around a lot of times by rhizomes. So it's slower moving, but it is definitely on the increase. So about a decade ago, we got called to some fields where Roundup was no longer performing very well on Johnson grass. We did some greenhouse screens to confirm the resistance, and sure enough, we had it. This was one of the greenhouse runs we ran. There on your left is a susceptible biotype of Johnson grass. There on your right is the resistant after 22 ounces of Roundup Power Max. We even went up to 88 ounces of Roundup Power Max and still had Johnson grass living, and that's kind of where we are. And it looks like this in the field. When you get called to the field, of course, the standard herbicide we've been using for years here in Tennessee has been Halix GT. And of course, Roundup is the herbicide in there that is going to help us on Johnson grass, but when it's resistant to Roundup, it's not a lot of help. So you get a little bit of whitening from the Callisto, and that's about it. So what do we do to try and control it? Well, we kind of went back to some of the herbicides we used before Roundup Ready Corn came out. So the Accents and the Steadfast, and then something a little newer, the Caprino. And again, Caprino's got an SU in there, thymocarbazone, which is in that same family as Accent, nickel sulfuron, and Steadfast. And all of those did help us on Johnson grass control, on this glyphosate-resistant biotype. This is just some of the data we did a couple years ago. This is Steadfast Q plus atrazine was one of the best options we had. And it's no wonder it was the #1 herbicide we were using back when Roundup Ready Corn wasn't on the market. Some of the pictures, there's your Steadfast on the left, there's your Helix GT on the right. There's not a lot of difference there to speak of. But not only that, what about the annual grasses? Jungle rice in particular. We're seeing more and more issues with it, the glyphosate-resistant version of it be out there. And then especially when we're just trying to get by with some Roundup and atrazine, it's really becoming an issue. So again, we've looked at some different herbicides here, and it's really a lot of the same herbicides that we recommend for vines or Johnson grass. Steadfast Q would be a very good option. You put it up to 7-leaf corn. Acuron GT, you can apply it up to 8-leaf corn. Caprino, up to 7-leaf corn. All those would be good options to help us out on some of these vines. Let's switch to soybeans, and of course we know it's no secret we're all in on Extend soybeans in this state. Big majority of it that we're growing here is Extend. And it's worked fairly well, but we've had some issues. Early on, it was more the grasses, the jungle rice and the barnyard grasses, where Roundup tank mixed with Dicamba was not controlling it. Some of it was due to Roundup-resistant barnyard grass in this case, but some of it, quite frankly, is due to the Dicamba ingenium, in this case, inhibiting the translocation of Roundup. That's what we found in some further research. And this is the research here. Clay Perkins, a former graduate student of mine, this is some of his research where we looked at Roundup on this jungle rice with the TTI nozzles, the Dicamba nozzles, compared to the AIXRs, the flat fans. And we can see we got better control with those AIXRs. And if you think about it, particularly the barnyard grass complex has more of a straight up and down leaf. And those big old droplets have a more tendency to roll off those than they would a flatter leaf like a pigweed. So I think that's why we see control suffer just a little bit. But you add the Dicamba in, and then the drift protection agent that's also instructed on the label. You add this to the TTI, and you basically have a swing and a miss on control. We see a similar thing even with clethodim, though it's not quite as robust as far as the lack of control loss, but it's still very notable. So what are we doing to control it? We're just going out with the straight goods Roundup, or in this case, this picture was straight goods clethodim. Can take it down. Some of this even pretty big jungle rice or out there, but don't mix it with the Dicamba, and use your flat fan nozzles. Also, it helps to use like we used to back in the day, 10 gallons per acre. Lower gallonage work better with Roundup and with clethodim if you're just going out solo product. Switch gears now and talk about our two pigweeds that we're having more and more of an issue with. Palmer amaranth. It's basically now become, at least in the U.S., resistant to 9 different herbicide modes of action, which is truly remarkable. Water hemp as well, 8 different herbicide modes of action. Palmer's primary pigweed we have in the Middle Tennessee, but water hemp sure made some strides, of all places, in Middle Tennessee. And I don't know why, but we see it more there, at least in the last year or so, than we have in the past. It seems like it's really gaining some ground. And I think part of it's due to its Dicamba tolerance. We're seeing the biotype that we're getting run into in Middle Tennessee. So let's go back to 2014. This is on Palmer amaranth, and back then when we were evaluating the whole program, Dicamba looked very, very, very good on pigweed. 90% control is what we typically got when we put a pre and came back with Roundup Dicamba. But we're starting to see some resistance. So why are we seeing it more so here in Tennessee, maybe than some other states? And you look at the 2 of the I states, Illinois and Iowa. They got over 20 million acres of row crops. Tennessee, we got just shy of 3. Why is that important? Well, despite having not near the row crop acres as those two states, we used in the last 25 years almost twice as much dicamba per square acre. So we've exposed a lot of our pigweed for 25 years, or a good 20 years since when horseweed became resistant, to fairly low rate of dicamba, typically 8 ounces, right? A quarter pound, which is half what we're using over the top of our row extend crops now. So I think part of the reason we're seeing resistance here in Tennessee quicker than some other states is we've been selecting and using a lot more dicamba and exposing a lot of pigweed to a lot more dicamba over the past 2 decades, and at fairly low rates. And I think we've primed a pump and kind of predisposed some of our pigweed to become resistant quicker than maybe some other areas. Our first calls on this came in 2019, where farmers were starting to have issues. There's 2 shots of Ingenia, didn't give good control. This was over in Bedford County, Tennessee. So this is in Middle Tennessee, one of the fields we got called to, where you basically have soybeans and pigweed. And that really gets your attention. This isn't really our first rodeo on this. Some of our first Roundup resistant pigweed fields look like this. Some of the first PPO and Roundup resistant fields look like this. So this really got our attention, and we started grabbing seed and doing greenhouse screens. Another field, this is a cotton field in Gibson County. Again, surviving Roundup dicamba. This is in Madison County. 2 applications of Roundup and Ingenia going to seed here. So it's off and running, unfortunately, in particularly the middle part of West Tennessee. This is more recent. This is Gibson County, taken this past year after a healthy rate of Roundup and dicamba to have quite a few survivors. This is not uncommon this past year. So how resistant are they? This has kind of got me concerned from the 2021. This was a location we knew we had some dicamba resistance there, and we did a rate study. That's 176 ounces of XtendiMax on that pigweed, and it's still alive. We got dead ones here, plenty of dead ones, but it's still alive. And out of the frame, there were several others that also lived. There was a few pigweed that lived, and of course all the nutsedge. Nutsedge wasn't a surprise, but the pigweed getting through that much dicamba was. Clearly it was taking the next step. This is one of the farmers' fields down the road from that research. It's basically a pigweed field with some soybean in it. And again, it's escaping multiple applications of Ingenia. Some of the research, Delaney Foster, she's a PhD student doing the work on this. So we looked at, in this study, she looked at 22 ounces of XtendiMax on 2 to 4 inch palmer, 6 to 8, and 10 to 12. It really didn't matter when she sprayed it, the control was poor. Even when she doubled the rate, the control wasn't very good. She had to get up to 88 ounces of XtendiMax and spray it on small weeds to get the control we were even getting close to a few years ago with 22 ounces. So it's clearly evolving and becoming more resistant over time to dicamba. One of the things that really got my attention over in Hales Point, the Gold Dust Bottom, was some fields where pigweed not only escaped dicamba, but also escaped Liberty follow-up applications. This really had me concerned, mostly because it was showing up in these farmers' fields, as well as research we had just underneath that cloud bank you see off in the horizon end, which is just right above the river. We saw very similar activity. This field and this location isn't too far away from just across the river in Arkansas, where they've confirmed Liberty-resistant palmer pigweed, and we fear that maybe some of that pollen has crossed the river, and these pigweeds are the offspring of that and have a little Liberty resistance on top of the dicamba resistance. It's just not an extend problem, though. It also is a problem in enlist. And what we're finding is if the pigweed's resistant to dicamba, palmer, amaranth that is, it's also resistant to enlist or 2,4-D. And this was a field in Gibson County that had survived both enlist 1 and a Liberty application. This was from a couple locations where we noticed some really substandard performance with just single dose application of of either Dicamba, 2,4-D, or Liberty, very poor control. But even though like 2,4-D and Liberty didn't work well, when we tank mixed the two, they did. And that at least gives us some hope that we have an option there. Or even if we go with Dicamba and glyphosate and follow it up 7 days later, it also worked well. So in Tennessee and West Tennessee, we primarily have Palmer amaranth. We're seeing more and more water hemp in Middle Tennessee, and then you can find a bunch of other pigweeds, particularly in Middle and East Tennessee, more along the lines of pastures and such. But you can see a little bit more variance of pigweed populations as far as what species in Middle Tennessee. But the two of most concern are Palmer and common water hemp. And because we can see both in this state, they're really hard to tell apart when they're little. You really got to wait until they flower out and get mature. If you measure the flowering branches in feet, it's Palmer amaranth. If you measure them in inches, it's water hemp. This was some water hemp in the Cumberland River bottom in Montgomery County. We were called to this field several years ago. Survived 2 applications of a pint of Ingenia. Same fields. A year later, same herbicide regime a year later, and the results are the same but worse. More population survived the Ingenia Roundup application. We sent seed off from that up to Indiana to Purdue University, where they did a screen looking at a susceptible check, which is the purple X's here, and you look at the green pluses here, that's the Tennessee population, and we can see we have some of the most resistant water hemp to Dicamba in their screen, even more so than some of the Indiana population they were looking at. Probably of so much concern, the 1X rate, which would be right here in the greenhouse, 70%, so 7 out of every 10 were living at the end of the rating period, which was very consistent with what we were seeing in the field. This is this past year, 2021, just downriver from there with more water hemp going to seed. And we did some field studies out there. Same song, second verse, 22 ounces of Extendamax, gave control about 40%, very comparable to what we see with Dicamba on Palmer amaranth that's resistant to. So how resistant are they? Water hemp is 4.5x Dicamba resistant. What's probably interesting about the water hemp, though, is still susceptible to 2,4-D. In fact, it was more susceptible to 2,4-D in Purdue's greenhouse screens than their susceptible check was. Palmer amaranth's a different story. If it's both the Palmer that we find is both 4x Dicamba and 2,4-D resistant. So where we're finding it in the state for Palmer amaranth, right here we're looking at these middle West Tennessee counties, Crockett, Gibson, Madison, and then even further west now, Lauderdale County. We've confirmed Dicamba resistant pigweed in those states, also resistant to 2,4-D, or in those counties, also resistant to 2,4-D. And we're checking in some other counties. Likewise, we've confirmed Dicamba resistant water hemp in Montgomery County, and we got some suspect populations in some others that we will check. So how are we going to try and control it? We're overlapping residuals, and this goes for cotton or soybeans, but go out there and put a residual down at planting and then follow with another one early post-emergence over the top. And depending on row width, you may want a third one. The other thing is doing some things you don't pour out of a jug. Cover crops would be a good avenue here to think about. The shade they offer inhibits pigweed from coming up, but also some of the chemicals coming out of the cover crop as it dries down and dies. This is some work Dr. Avat Shakufa did, our physiologist, looking at where she took some of the residue from it, dried it down, and got some extract out of it. And pigweed just did not germ or go very well if it did germ, get a good start, when it was growing in leachate from those cover crops, whereas compared to strained water. So it almost acts like a pre-emergence herbicide. It's not a long-lived pre-emergence herbicide, but it will give you a couple weeks, and you add a residual herbicide to that, you've got a pretty robust start to a pigweed management plan. So take home for 2022, have a plan B herbicide choice if plan A isn't there. We all know Liberty's very tight. Roundup can be very tight, so we have to look at maybe some clethodim in there. And because Liberty's being tight, on top of we're starting to see dicamba resistance, we're really going to have to go back to the fundamentals of what we did prior to extend crops coming out. We've got to start clean with either tillage or paraquat, and then overlap residual herbicides to where we're every about 2 to 3 weeks early on in the crop's life, we're putting another residual herbicide. So as one's starting to give up, the other one will pick up the slack. That's about the best thing I know that we can do. With that, I thank you for your attention and hope you all have a good day.